Welcome to You Can Talk to Me, a Beatles podcast. It's time to make our way across the universe and talk all things John, Paul, George and Ringo.
Welcome along to a very special episode 25. This week I'm sitting down with Allan Kozzin. Allan's been quite a prolific Beatles author over recent years. He's the man behind the work Got That Something, How the Beatles' I Want to Hold Your Hand Changed Everything. Together then with Adrian Sinclair, we have two of the most important Beatles books in recent years, the McCartney Legacy, Volume 1 and Volume 2. You'll also find Allan regularly on Things We Said Today, the Beatles podcast, for which I will leave a link in this episode description, well worth checking out. I began by sitting down with Allan and asking how it came to be that music and journalism together informed so much of his life.
My idea growing up was to become a musician, and I studied lots of different instruments. I started with piano, I studied violin, trombone, a few weeks of French horn before trombone, and guitar. Guitar was my favorite of the instruments, partly because, you could play lots of popular stuff with it. And it just felt, good to me more than the other instruments did. But the thing is, you couldn't, at that time, we're talking about like around 71, 72, most music schools didn't accept guitar as an actual instrument. So my parents had this idea. They didn't want me to be a musician anyway, because, all the reasons that no parent wants their kid to be a musician. Mm-hmm. And my father was a lawyer, come from a long line of lawyers, and they wanted me to be a lawyer. And they felt that I had the aptitude for that, and that, that's what I should do. And they said, well, you know what? You're a good writer. Why don't you get a journalism degree? And that would be an easier thing to get into law school with than a music degree. And I reluctantly said, well, okay. So I went to Syracuse University, which has a great journalism school. And they also have a pretty good music school. And by the end of the first semester, I had arranged to take guitar lessons at the music school as an elective course. And I just sort of, felt like this is what I want to do. So at the end of the first semester, I auditioned to get into the music school and got in. Mm-hmm. But of course, this set up a conflict with my parents. So basically, I ended up majoring in both, but there was no joint degree at Syracuse University. So I ended up staying summers and taking extra courses, and ended up with enough college credits to have a master's degree. But what I ended up with was 2 bachelor's degrees, one in music, one in journalism. And then when I got out of school, basically, I wanted as a musician, I wanted to be a composer. It took about 15 seconds looking around to realize that composers aren't really very well treated, even in the music world, because I was going to be a classical composer, Yeah. I mean, the Beatles were always in the background, but, I studied classical music. That was what my degree was. And so I started writing, and I started pitching articles to various people, including the New York Times, because, I didn't want to start small. Yeah. I wrote for a lot of other magazines, too, all over the place. And eventually the Times hired me. And while I was there, because I had this sort of Beatles thing on the side, there was a tape that came out called Around the Beatles. Yeah. Which John Perellas was reviewing at the Times, and he reviewed it as a live performance, but it wasn't entirely live. They had taped it in the studio the day before, and then they lip-synced to it when they filmed it the next day, except that in some cases you can hear Paul singing along with the recorded track. So you've got 2 vocals, and, but they've got audience dubbed over it and all that. And you could be forgiven for thinking it's a live performance. So I wrote John a note saying, this is what it actually is. So a couple of months later, when the Beatles' first CDs were coming out, John called me up and he said, look, why don't you review them? I'll just do a piece about how they're coming out, but when they come out, you review them and, go through your whole discomania thing and anything you want to do, and that's fine. And so I did that. And in effect, with that piece, which called out EMI for putting them out in mono only, I became basically the Times' Beatles desk for the next couple of decades. And so that was fun. I mean, I was reviewing classical music by night and periodically writing about the Beatles for the Times as well when something happened that needed writing about. That included when Mark Lewison's book, the Recording Sessions book, came out, interviewed him. When Paul and Ringo came around on tour after not touring for a while in 1989, I interviewed both of them. And really anything that was Beatles related that came up, I got to do. So that was, was a lot of fun. And not that I disliked doing the classical stuff. I mean, I lived for all of this. And, but the Beatles stuff made it a sort of a, special, it's sort of like, the classical stuff was the meal and the Beatles stuff was the dessert.
Well said. You had a lovely line there. I didn't want to start small. And even at this point in the story, it's been a big life with regard to your passions. What advice might you give to a young writer with a similar kind of passion who might look at a career like your own and draw some inspiration from that, this idea of let's not start small?
Basically the thing to do that they teach you in journalism school really is that, you have to read the magazines that you want to write for or newspapers and know what they cover and what they have covered and also what they haven't covered that you think they should cover. So find something that you think is really important that somehow they have neglected and write to them about why it is that this is really important and should be covered. I mean, you're not going to obviously accuse them of neglecting it because that's not a way to make friends with editors. But, coming up with a really good idea that they haven't thought of is actually a good way to be seen as valuable by an editor. So, basically, a young person who wants to do this should just be reading all the publications in the field he wants to write about, or she, and, and do that, come up with a topic, send a good proposal, a good persuasive proposal, and, someone will take you on. Eventually, you might get a lot of rejections for a while, but eventually, if you keep at it, they'll take you on. And the other thing is that once they agree to do it, make sure that you're, first of all, sending them clean copy that they're not going to have to rewrite. Be really diligent about it. And the second is meet your deadline. It's amazing how many editors have told me about people filing late, and I never missed a deadline in my life. And I've been doing this now for quite a long time. And, and that was one thing that really helped me get more jobs. At the beginning, I was reliable. So be reliable. That's the other advice I can give.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
it's
wonderful.
Hard now, I mean, when I was starting to do this, there were lots of physical magazines devoted to music and newspapers devoted chunks of real estate to arts coverage. And all of that's changing, I mean, when I went to the Times, there were 5 staff critics and 1 stringer. Stringer is a non-staff person who contributes often more than the staff people, but isn't on staff, which fundamentally means don't get health benefits and pension and all that stuff. And everyone starts as a stringer and gets taken on eventually if they're good. These days, the Times has like one staff classical music critic and maybe one or two staff pop critics. That's it. So it's hard now, it's a difficult field to get into, and I'm glad I started when I did rather than now.
Yeah. Do you have a memory of when the Beatles did actually hit you and what that meant to you as a young man?
Oh yeah. Like almost everyone else in this country, the Ed Sullivan Show appearance on February 9th, 1964 was a big thing. I had heard them before then, though, because when I Want to Hold Your Hand came out, because of Carol James, a DJ in Washington, D.C., who began playing it and sending it around to other DJs around the country, to the point where Capitol Records, which had decided that they would bring it out, weren't ready. And so they actually put out like injunctions to, cease and desist playing this record, but radio stations played it anyway. And at the end of December 63 or the very beginning of January, I remember being in a store with my father. I was 9, and hearing it on the radio and saying, oh, okay, that's what the Beatles are about. And then I watched them on Sullivan. And, back then, all the kids in your class were into it. And so my pals and I would sort of, go down to my friend's basement after school and pick up a broom and, play the records and pretend to be singing along and, had Beatle wigs, all that stuff. But at that point for me, it was sort of a passing thing. I liked it, I listened to it, and then I went on to other stuff, which included my, classical studies. And here's where it really took hold permanently. One day I was at a piano lesson, and my teacher was the daughter of one of Franz Liszt's last students, and she had framed cigar butts of Liszt all over her house and everything. And anyway, I was waiting for my father to pick me up, and a car drove by, and it was a convertible, and the top was down, and it was spring, probably spring 65. Yeah. And the car was full of high school kids, boys and girls. And the radio was on, and She Loves You was on, and they were all singing along and having a great time. And so now I was 10, and this was the end of latency for me, because it was sort of like, wow, cars, girls, Beatles, this is the life. And then from then on, it was like, I just paid really close attention to the Beatles all the time. This was 65, so they were going to be a going concern for another 5 years. And that meant that, every now and every 3 or 4 months, you knew that they were going to release another single. And so you come home from school and you go to the radio, and there were basically 2 big stations in New York at the time. And I would just keep going back and forth between the 2 until finally one of them would say, and here it is, a WMCA exclusive, the new Beatles single, and play it, and I would, try and tape it so I could hear it at will, and then go get it when it came out. And, basically our years and weeks were sort of defined by what the Beatles were putting out at the time. And, we all had our, interpretations of what's going on and in the songs and in the group. We were following magazines, but, in those days, journalism was not really keyed into what was going on in the pop world in that kind of detail. There was no Rolling Stone yet. What there were these sort of teeny bot magazines. There was one called 16, and basically you could count on them for pictures about the Beatles, and you could count on them for some news about the Beatles. And one of them actually reproduced sections of, there was a British magazine called the Beatles Monthly Book, which subsequently I collected all of, but in those days I couldn't even think of a thing like that. But they reproduced part of that magazine, so it had a lot of Beatle news in it, so we could keep up that way. And it became a real fascination. So I had this sort of bifurcated musical existence, between classical music and the Beatles and other rock, obviously, I was listening to. But much as I loved the Stones and the Kinks and the Who and everything from that era, and then up through when it began to change, like King Crimson, and prog things. I mean, the Beatles were always sort of a special, like, cut above everything else. I mean, I used when I was at the Times, I used to go around saying, the Beatles are the zenith of Western Civ. You realize that, right? And I was only partly joking.
You very well described that idea of how they were informing the 60s, that, we're hanging on every release and lyrically, musically, what's it doing? Paul Weller tells a great story of the first time he heard Strawberry Fields Forever. He was driving in his car and they announced it on the radio. And the moment that song started, it just blew the back of his mind. And he writes about how he had to pull the car over. He couldn't drive as that song was playing. He had to sit in it and go, what's happening here? What are they doing?
Yeah, I mean, and that track was so different from anything they had put out before. I mean, if you consider, like, what was their previous single before that, Yellow Submarine? It was a huge leap. And if you think also that the distance from I Want to Hold Your Hand to Strawberry Fields Forever is like 3 years.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing. There's that great footage of Dick Clark on Bandstand in 67 playing the kids the new single double A side from the Beatles and then asking for the kids. I'm sure you're very familiar with it more than I am. And it's fascinating to watch it as a time capsule where you can sort of see the Beatles are leaving the time that they're in.
Yeah. That is a very funny clip to watch.
Yeah.
But,
I'm just curious, before we move on into your story, you mentioned a little earlier, you had these moments where you're sitting opposite Paul and Ringo and conducting interviews. What were those experiences like for you? And did you get a sense of each of them as much as you could in a setting like that?
It was a little scary and it was a little magical, more than a little magical. But on the other hand, I'm very aware of the fact that I'm there to do a job, and I had interviewed lots of stars, at least in the classical music world. I mean, I was a classical guitarist. I interviewed Andre Segovia, Julian Bream, John Williams, all of the big guys there. And, and those things were very special to me too. But, there's a certain amount of magic walking into a room and there's Ringo or Paul sitting there. And especially Paul. I mean, Ringo is a good interviewee and he can be funny and have some interesting things to say. But Paul is the most professional interviewee I have ever seen. I mean, you walk into the room and I've interviewed him a bunch of times now, and he has a way of making you feel as if you're old pals and there is nothing he would rather do than answer your questions. Now, as a journalist that is absolutely not true, but he has a way of putting you at ease. He's very aware of that. And also in the case of Paul, because I had read, I can't say every interview he's ever done, but I've read an awful lot of his interviews. I mean, I collect them, and it's and this was way before the McCartney Legacy. I mean, I just would collect everything to do with the Beatles that came into my orbit. So newspaper articles, magazine articles, TV. And I had a huge collection of Paul McCartney interviews, so I knew a lot of his stories and his set pieces, like I Dreamed Yesterday, and all those.
Yes.
So I was determined not to ask questions that would get those answers. And I thought we had a really good interview because of that, because some of the questions I asked him, he was, obviously not prepared for, and so gave a really honest answer. For instance, this was 1990, my first interview with him. And I said, when you were in the Beatles, you had this rule about how you didn't want singles on albums. And the reason you gave was that you wanted your fans to get value for money. And, these days, you put out a single, you'll put it out in like 5 versions, 3 of them available only in Japan, each of them with different B-sides. So to get all the B-sides of this single, you end up spending more than you'd spent on the album. So why do you do that? And, he said, well, I'm not the only one doing it. And I said, yeah, but you, and he finished the sentence. He said, yeah, we had a rule.
That's great.
So, and he said, here's the thing. And this was another thing that surprised me that you don't see him saying very much. In those days, we were the Beatles. And if we wanted to do something or not want to do something, we would just say it, and that was it. I'm not the Beatles. I have to think very carefully about what I put out. And if a record company guy comes to me and says, here's an idea, we think, maybe you could put out this B-side and that B-side in these different territories, I have to think very carefully before I say no, and I might say yes. So, there was that. And so that interview was like an hour long.
Wow.
Most of his interviews these days are like 20 minutes.
Yeah.
And, I thought we had a really good time. And I think because of that and subsequent interviews that we did, even though he wouldn't talk to us specifically for the McCartney Legacy, when people went to him and said, these guys want to interview me, do you mind if I talk to them? He always said, no, go ahead, So he didn't do anything to stand in our way. He didn't talk to us. But on the other hand, that's okay, because, we have this huge archive of interviews he's done. So we know what he has to say about most things. We'd love to talk to him and, ask him some questions maybe that people haven't asked. But, failing that, we're talking to everyone around him that we can get to. And that's given us a lot of interesting stories that we had never heard before. So, so long as we're not persona non grata, it's working out pretty well. And we're about to start volume 3, so we'll see when we begin approaching people for interviews whether anything has changed.
Yeah, I spoke last week with Rob Frith out of Canada, who stumbled across that master tape recording from Decca, and we were just talking about his experience handing those tapes to Paul. And it's consistent with what you're saying. He made a comment that he felt like when he was finished meeting Paul and the band, that he'd been spending time with an old school friend. Paul met him with a hug, and while they were looking at the tapes, Paul placed an arm around him and turned to him and said, "Thanks, man. No one does this. Normally someone's asking for something, and I want to thank you for this." And he said that he was completely disarmed. And it's consistent with what you're saying too, this idea that he's very aware that you're very aware of who he is and what he is, and he wants you to be disarmed. And I think for Rob to walk away from that feeling like it was like I'd known him for years, and then Paul's obviously got a knack for keeping you present with him and out of your own head a little bit.
He also has a remarkable memory for people he has met and spoken to, far better than mine.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you why I say that. So I interviewed him the first time in 1990. At the end of 1991, he came to New York to do a press conference at Weil Recital Hall, which is the small recital hall that's part of Carnegie Hall, about the Liverpool Oratorio. having its New York premiere. And I was there, and I had gone to Liverpool and reviewed the oratorio for the Times. And so I was just at the press conference. I didn't ask any questions. I was just sitting there. And after he got off the stage, I was about to leave the hall with everybody else. There was a little reception downstairs that he was going to be at, and I guess I was going to go. I don't know. And one of Carnegie Hall's press people had her walkie-talkie and sort of came to me and said, Paul wants to see you. I said, what do you mean Paul wants to see me? So he saw you in the audience and he wanted to talk to you. And I said, okay. So before he came out for that reception, they brought me into, where the reception was going to be. And he said, listen, I just wanted to thank you for the Liverpool Oratorio Review because you gave it a chance. It probably was the only generally positive review from among the classical reviewers. And but I still like that piece, actually. There's a lot of good stuff in it. And anyway, so I said, listen, that piece, that review was going to be on the front page. And because something happened in New York City about the subways, it got booted off the front page. But in the national edition, it was on the front page. And when you have a front page piece at the Times, usually this is just for your first front page piece. But if it's a special piece, you can get what they call a plating, which is basically the big aluminum plate that they print the paper from. And since I was in Liverpool and couldn't just go down and get it the next day myself, I really made a pain in the butt of myself to my editors. And because, we're editing it over the phone after the concert was over, I was in the office of the Anglican Church, a cathedral where the performance was. They let me, have a desk, and I did that, edited it, and said, look, you got to get me a plating of the national edition. And I ended up with 2 platings. Wow. So I said to him, told him that, and I said, so I have spare if you want one. And he said, yeah, that'd be great. Yeah. And then, other people began coming up to talk to him, because the reception was starting. And so I just sort of slinked away. And he came out from a crowd of people and said, hey, so how are we going to arrange that?
So good.
And I said, well, I'll call your guy. And, I called this guy. And then the next day I went to his hotel and gave it to him. And so that was a really nice moment. The other thing about it was that he said, Linda's father is a big New York Times reader. And he read me the review over the phone the next day. And he died shortly after that. So basically, you've done a good thing. And I thought, well, that was a nice thing to say. Yeah. Linda was standing right next to him. So, that was
wonderful.
A nice little adventure. So I went up to his hotel, gave him the thing, and that was that.
Yeah, it's really wonderful. With the McCartney Legacy, I remember when Volume 1 was released and going through that book, and it felt like another moment of when Mark's Complete Recordings was released. I remember when that book dropped, and as a hardcore fan, and that felt like, oh, this is a shift in Beatles authorship. This is another level here. And then when Legacy 1 dropped, it was that same kind of feeling that, oh, this is an important work. And now we're blessed with Volume 2, and together with yourself and Adrian Sinclair, there's this again raising of the bar with Beatles authorship. And I'm curious, how did you each come at that process, appreciating the enormity of the ground you were covering? How do you approach something of that scale? And like you said before, I always meet my deadlines. What was your method there?
Well, both of us really admire Mark Lewison's work, and wanted to do for Paul's life what he has been doing for the Beatles, and actually this project started as being, the idea was that we would do a McCartney version of the Lewison recording sessions book, not a biography. Mark talked us into doing a biography, actually, because the problem is that Mark was allowed into Abbey Road, played the tapes, saw the paperwork. We haven't been allowed to do anything like that with McCartney stuff. And there is a monumental amount of McCartney stuff compared to Beatles stuff, because he's constantly recording demos. He's constantly doing things. And, and then once you got into the digital age, he has spoken about how a truckload came up to his studio in Sussex and was unloading master tapes. And he said, well, how many albums is this? And they said, oh, no, this is just Take It Away. From the Broad Street version.
Yeah.
And, so that's a problem. Adrian came up with the idea. We knew each other from some Beatles chat board kind of things, and trading unreleased stuff and whatever. And he said, would you be interested? What I'd like to do is something like the Beatles recording sessions, but for McCartney. And maybe what you could do is write for each album a chapter about what was going on in his life at the time. And I said, yeah, sure. Why not? And this was just a modest little thing. He wanted to put it out as like a series of PDFs. And we started researching, and, Adrian lives in Yorkshire and has access to the British Library, which has every newspaper and magazine published on this planet. And we could say the known universe, because why not? And so he began methodically going through copying articles and collecting information about what McCartney was up to from the second he left the Beatles, and of course I had my own files from over the years as well. So I contributed a bit towards that. I scanned them all and sent them to Adrian. Adrian then prepared a timeline, and the timeline was very detailed and referred to a lot of the articles. So sometimes he would have, a quote taken from the article, and I would usually go back and look at the actual article in case there was something more in the quote than Adrian had taken that I might also want, or I might want to see context or whatever else, and then there were the recordings. A lot of his demos have been bootlegged, but probably only a fraction. And there are a lot of outtakes that have gotten out as well. And then he began putting out the archival editions, which were really helpful because sometimes he included his track list diagrams of, what was going on in each recording. And that took, if you're just a general reader looking at it, it's okay. Yeah, it's kind of nice to see. But if you're doing what we were doing, we had to sort of forensically take it apart and put it back together while listening to the tracks, to try and see how it was made. And you would just discover lots of nifty little musical things, like a piece that turns out to really be based just on a certain finger pattern sliding up and down the fretboard, which never would have occurred to me listening to it. But when I sat down to play it, we would get the tablature for things, and we would, just sort of make sure we knew what it was like under our fingers. And Adrian's a guitarist as well. And so, yeah, we put that together, and the timeline would then expand into the book, which I would mostly do. Adrian, sometimes if there was a particular period he was fascinated with, he would write a chapter. And then I always say I would put it through the Kozzinator to make it stylistically consistent with the rest,
Yeah.
And now the one thing is that I think we were contracted to write something like 125,000 words for each of the first two books. And we did cut it down to about 475,000 for each of the books. But our editors were incredibly indulgent. I mean, there's something I could not have gotten away with in a newspaper.
No doubt.
But they decided that, you know what, this is good stuff, and there's been nothing like it, and we should go with it. So they did, and we're grateful that they did. So and they've signed up for Volume 3 as well, and we're still actually waiting for the contract, but it's apparently close at hand.
Yeah.
And we'll start the process again. Now, this time we're starting with him in jail in Japan.
Yeah.
So, and the third book will be a whole decade, unlike the first two. I mean, in a certain way, with the first two, we had to establish, his state of mind after the Beatles and all of this stuff. But with the third book, we now, I think, have painted a 1,500-page portrait of what his life is like up to 1980. So from 1980 to 1990, we can do in one chunk. And there was, he did an awful lot during that period, but, he goes back on tour at the end of it. After not touring for that whole decade. I mean, John being killed was sort of a major thing that, would have put a crimp into any plans he might have had to tour. He just didn't. So, so there's a lot of drama in this volume that we're going to have to somehow figure out how to get into one volume.
I think it was Jack Douglas that said, when he's asked what was John like, he answered, listen to the music and listen to the lyrics. That's him in there. That's his voice. That was his nature. That was the way that he spoke. And that is John. There's no artifice. How would you describe, when you go through, as you say, that forensic process of unearthing all of that detail, and as you described, getting on the guitar and making these little micro discoveries about how the music's built? Do you get a sense of how the man is built through these experiences, the more that you sort of peel back layers? Do you get a deeper sense of him?
Yeah, with Paul, in a way, it's the opposite. With Paul, there's a lot of artifice, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way. I mean it in the sense that, John, after the Beatles, certainly just wanted to write about himself one way or another, either his political feelings in the beginning of the 70s or his feelings about, life with Yoko, on the final album. Paul isn't really that way. Paul will come up with a fictional story and write a song about that. He'll come up with a turn of phrase that he likes and build a song around that. That don't necessarily reflect, his inner being, but that's what music does in a way, because, when you write music, that is your essence in a way coming out in audible form, so you may write a story about, Desmond and Molly.
Yeah.
But the musical choices you make to bring that story to life are really interesting. And, in that case, I mean, this is before our book and either of our books, because it was a Beatles track, but, it was basically Calypso. And we know all through the early part of Paul's solo career, and probably to this day, he's fascinated with reggae, so you get to a lot of, by taking his music apart, you get to a lot of, what is it that interests him musically, and how does he process that through the, McCartneyator and make it into something that is totally his, which he does. You hear a McCartney track, it's a McCartney track, and not just because of the voice. There's a certain quality of what he does and how he thinks musically that we found really sort of enlightening. And and it's a funny thing because as a kid, I was more of a John guy, and after the Beatles breakup, I mean, this is one of the things that we found in writing Volume 1. There really didn't have to be that kind of bifurcation. You're either a John guy or a Paul guy, or a John girl or a Paul girl. That was all silly. And in the case of John and Paul, I really believe that a lot of it had to do with Rolling Stone. Rolling Stone was at the time a really very influential magazine, and they were a very young magazine too. And they were very partial to John. I don't think anybody would argue that they weren't. And partly because, look, for their very first issue, John gave them the Two Virgins cover to print on their cover. And then John gave them, anytime he wanted an interview, John would sit down, usually with Jan Wenner, the publisher, and give a long or short interview, but he would give Wenner the feeling that he's like bringing him right into the proceedings and telling him what's going on, including when the Beatles were having their sort of, problems about Alan Klein and whether Alan Klein should be their manager. And, Rolling Stone covered that. Here's the thing, though. Jan Wenner went to England in April 1970, and on April 9th, 1970, he interviewed Paul. Paul did not mention to him that the very next day he was going to distribute press copies of the McCartney album, which included a self-interview in which he says he doesn't foresee working with the Beatles again and doesn't enjoy it and doesn't, it was a sort of very dyspeptic interview. But you can understand why if you understand the dynamics of what was going on. And but Wenner, I think Wenner took that out on Paul, because when the McCartney album came out, someone reviewed it and wrote a straightforward, generally positive review. And Wenner said, no, this isn't just an album. This is a Trojan horse. Based on the fact that there was that interview. But of course, regular old consumers were not getting that interview, only the press, and mostly only the press in Britain. In the US, I believe the Eastmans sent out press copies that had the interview too. But they had to rewrite the review as a kind of, dealing with Paul's manifesto against the Beatles. And so it became, there's John and his view of the Beatles and Paul and his view of the Beatles. And DJs began picking that up too. And listeners like me, would listen to this stuff. And Paul didn't help by putting out, Mary Had a Little Lamb as a single. That really just sort of played into what the DJs were saying, what Rolling Stone was saying, And so, in a way, I'm really glad that I decided to, take up Adrian's offer to do this book. And also, I was saying it was going to be a sessionography. And Mark Lewison basically talked us into doing a biography, because he said, there isn't a full-scale biography. He's a very complicated guy. Mark worked for him for a while.
Yeah.
And as editor of Club Sandwich's fan magazine. And, I think you should do that. And so we talked about it, and finally we did. We put together a proposal. We got an agent, and the agent found a publisher, and here we are today.
This period that's coming up in Volume 3 with the 80s, and musically, some would say, an uneven time for Paul, kind of rediscovering musically who he's going to be. But you still get these wonderful, I think, these wonderful peaks in each era. For me, I'm a big press to play guy, and you'll often hear people are kind of on the fence or split. But I think it's a wonderful work at many levels. From your perspective, and I know it can change on any day, but when you go through those eras, relative to the time, what might be one album we could focus on just briefly that sticks out to you as being vitally important to Paul's evolution?
Okay, well, why don't I bypass the most obvious one, which would be Band on the Run?
Yes.
And possibly also Ram. Ram, at the time it came out, was, not a huge success, but subsequently has become a lot of people's favorite. So I'm going to go with something else that wasn't a huge success, and Paul didn't even like it that much, apparently, although I suspect if he spends some time with it, he'll revise that opinion. And that is Back to the Egg.
Yes, I'm with you.
And I'll tell you why. First of all, after a lot of personnel problems, I mean, the first two books go through all of, Wings, the various versions of Wings and people leaving and why they left and what happened. And, a lot of it was a mess and a lot of it was, not a mess. But with Back to the Egg, he probably had doubts about whether he wanted to continue having a band at this point, after the troubles with Jimmy McCulloch and then Joe English deciding to leave because he was homesick mainly. And Denny Lane actually pushed to get the new members in, and he basically was responsible for both new members of Wings, Lawrence Juber, guitarist, and Steve Holley, the drummer. He found them both, introduced them both to Paul, talked them up, and Paul signed them on. Now, here we have Paul finally has a band where, Lawrence Juber, excellent guitarist, classically trained. And, I have to have, special regard for someone who's a classically trained guitarist.
Yes, of course.
So, but, he's excellent. And he was a jazz player as well. And he could do anything Paul wanted from him. Steve Holley, too, really good drummer. And both of them as well had this quality of not wanting to sort of assert themselves necessarily within Wings, apart from doing the best they could with their parts, and so he finally has a band that isn't rebellious, and is writing really pretty good stuff. And Back to the Egg, he wanted to be a concept album about, driving along, listening to the radio and, on your way to a gig, not that you're playing, but one that you're going to, a concert. And you get to the concert and then the idea sort of fell apart. He had the beginning of it and it's all there, but he had these other ideas too, like the, fancy radio experiments and things like that he did, recording the people at the castle where he recorded this album. He recorded it at a place called Lime Castle, spelled Lymp. Lymphne, I think. And, I was calling it Limpney Castle until I interviewed Steve Holley, and he said, no, it's pronounced Lime. What can you do?
What are you going to do?
Yeah, this is it. I mean, because of the, the Norman invasion, the British are partly French, and so they've adopted this idea of not saying half a word every now and then from the way it's spelled. So anyway, that's an aside. Yeah. But So, Back to the Egg has, Spin It On. It's got some, great rock tracks. It's got some great experimental tracks.
Yeah.
Getting Closer dates back to around the time he wrote Band on the Run. We know this because we have a cassette that he made at Dustin Hoffman's rental place in Jamaica, where Dustin Hoffman, the famous story of Picasso's last words, "Drink to me." Dustin Hoffman said, could you just write a song about anything? And Paul said, well, I suppose. And well, here's a Time magazine about Picasso's death, and it talks about his last words. What can you do with that? And he just picked up a guitar and started singing, drink to me, drink to my health, and Dustin Hoffman is running around saying to his wife, he's doing it. And so Paul recorded a cassette at Dustin Hoffman's place of him working through Picasso's last words. And you can hear his daughters playing in the background, making noise and all kinds of stuff. But he also does Getting Closer.
Yeah.
There's a few other things on that tape too. So that's, we love finding stuff like that because we like to know the origin of a song and how long it's been kicking around before he did it. But that album, I think it's well recorded, produced by Chris Thomas.
Sounds great.
And Paul has a lot of things like this where when he finishes something, I mean, the amount of work that you put into it, you just don't want to hear it anymore. And in cases where he was taking something on tour, he obviously had to work up live versions of things and play them every night. But with Back to the Egg, they did a short British tour with, a handful of Back to the Egg songs, and then they were going to go to Japan, and we know what happened. But so he didn't play a lot of those songs that much, and he just thought of it, or thinks of it even, as an album that he didn't really like that much. When he finished it, he didn't do a lot of press about it. He sent Lawrence and Steve to the US to do interviews, and his rationale was, well, they're the new guys and people should get to know them.
Wow.
So they'll do the interviews about Back to the Egg. But Back to the Egg, I think just like with Ram, if people give it a chance, revisit it, and play it, there are some things, maybe people think Old Siam Sir is silly, and, okay, there's always a few silly tracks on a McCartney album, and, okay, big deal.
Yeah.
I think the album as a whole is exceptional. And, and plus you've got the Rockestra on there. Rockestra, you've got really a lot of good people playing on that. I mean, it's a pretty simple thing. And, for lyrics, we never got to the bottom of why the lyrics are, I haven't had any dinner. Why? What was it? Why haven't I had any dinner? Steve Holley thought originally, he thought this was just a placeholder for something else. But then when they went to record it, that was the actual lyric. And then they did it live, and that was the lyric. So, but it doesn't matter, it's just a funny thing, Yeah. And but there's and another thing, Baby's Request.
Yeah, of course.
Album. Incredible song. Yeah. Almost didn't get on the album. It wasn't meant for the album. It was meant for the Ink Spots. Paul went on vacation, went to see them.
Huh.
And they said, hey, you want to write us a song? And he said, yeah, sure. And so in a few days, they went back into the studio. They recorded that track as a demo, sent it along. And the group's manager said, yeah, okay, they can record it, but, you should pay them $1,000. And Paul said, that wasn't the idea. I was writing a song for them to do, they get the royalties. So he just put it on Back to the Egg, and it's a fantastic addition to Back to the Egg.
I agree. I'm so
Lawrence
glad to hear you
Cooper's
call that album out. I think it's the best packaged album. The striking cover art is the best thing Wings ever did, in my opinion. And I get, there's your Band on the Runs and your Rams. I play Back to the Egg and go back to that more than any other album for all the reasons you've said. Oh, more than any other album. Old Siam, Sir. I think that's as close to a Jimmy Page, Led Zeppelin rocker as he ever got. If you just go back and put fresh ears on that sounds like a Led Zeppelin lick right out of the gates. I think he's in great voice. I love the way that there was the film, the clips. There was so much beautiful media around that release as well.
Yeah. I love that Back to the Egg TV special. 7 songs, including Baby's Request, which was really nicely done on as if it was on an army base. Yeah, and we've been really disappointed that he hasn't put out an archival edition of Back to the Egg or London Town.
And that was my next question to you. Why do you think? And I guess you've explained that. Sometimes he doesn't seem to be the best judge of his own best work, and like you say, maybe it's because for him the experience. I lived it and I've sat in it and I've maybe lost the objectivity. But do you think the archive collection has been handbraked? Are we going to see a return, do you think?
Oh, I hope so. I don't have any information about whether it will happen or not, but, I have a feeling that the last several issues didn't sell as well as the label wanted them to. But, I think he should do it. I think he has to do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in fact, I don't know if when they announced Wings, the new compilation of Wings tracks, which, how many times have we had that already? But anyway, fine. They announced the Wings thing and they put out a little video trailer for it. I went onto YouTube the day they put the trailer up, and the first 50 comments were, yeah, but where are the Back to the Egg and London Town boxes? That's what we want.
There you go.
So, I hope he does it. We were hoping he would do it in time for us to, have it for volume 2 so that we'd have, maybe a few more outtakes and maybe a few more glimpses of his track sheets and things like that. But didn't, but he should do it anyway,
Yeah, I totally agree.
He has done most of the ones that we need for volume 3, not pressed to play yet, but he's done Flowers in the Dirt. If not for Back to the Egg, I would probably pick Flowers in the Dirt, because I think the collaborations with Elvis Costello on that are stunning.
Yeah.
And, So in fact, we're looking forward to, an opportunity to talk to Elvis about this, although I think he may feel that he's already said everything he has to say about the sessions, but I think we can ask him some questions he might not have been asked.
Yeah. So. Those acoustic demos with Elvis are just beautiful to have. So glad they're in the world.
Yeah.
Allan, you've been very generous with your time. Just a couple of last questions, and I thank you again. It's been a terrific honor to sit with you. And I'm sure you've been asked this question many times, and how do you possibly answer it? We're still talking about these 4 guys and that incredible story and that body of work. And then, of course, everything that comes in those solo years, particularly from Paul, that's still in motion. I know there's no quick, easy answer. Why do you think it is that every generation seems to jump on board and it endures like nothing else before or after? What do you think that is from a musician's perspective as well? I'm just curious to think what your take is.
I think probably because as the Beatles, and even as solo artists, they never really wanted to repeat themselves. They were always looking for something new to do. That's definitely true with Paul. He's doing experimental things, electronic things, orchestral things, artwork, books, all 4 of them, I think, have really or in the case of two of them, had really restless imaginations that that led them to break new ground every time. And certainly as a band, as the Beatles, they did, and possibly because they were trying to outdo each other as well, you know. And it's possible that that could be the case, and something they came up with turned out to not appeal to anybody. But in their case, everything they came up with, you know, you might have had some kids on American Bandstand not understanding what's going on with Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane when it first came out, but I bet you 3 weeks later they did.
Yeah.
You know, I think that it's, you know, there was always something new. And there was always something new and interesting and colorful and, you know, imaginative. The imaginative thing, that's probably the key. These are guys with incredible imagination. And, you know, and there could be people out there saying, oh, yeah, really, but Ringo, you know, Ringo too. And yeah, you know, as a Beatle, you listen to his drum parts. You listen to his drum parts on A Day in the Life, Strawberry Fields, Rain, a lot of those, all through the White Album, all through Pepper. It's like he thinks orchestrally as a drummer. You know, he might be embarrassed to hear that even because he's not like a classical guy in any kind of way. And all four of them were self-taught and intuitive. But they were all so incredibly musical, like right down to the, you know, bottom of their soul, that everything they did was just going to be, you know, bright and innovative and, you know, and something to hear. And there's something about that, you know, every generation comes along and people can hear that. You know, and not to mention that, you know, they have a built-in on-ramp in the form of the Yellow Submarine movie. Every child for the last, I'd say 2 or 3 generations has seen Yellow Submarine, and that's their introduction to the Beatles. And so they're also getting Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, Eleanor Rigby, you know, Hey Bulldog, all kinds of stuff, you know, and so it's just it's just sort of a built-in thing. I mean, I always used to say that as a joke, along with height of zenith of Western Civ, that, you know, after 1970, for any kid born after 1970, the Beatles are innate knowledge, you know, that sort of knowledge that you're born with. And it seems almost to be true, you know. There's just something in that music that people respond to instantly. I mean, I know there are people who don't like the Beatles. I've heard of them. But you know, like I think Ozzy Osbourne said, you know, not long before he died, when someone interviewed him about the Beatles, he said, you know, I don't understand not liking the Beatles. You know, how could it doesn't make any sense to me to not like the Beatles. So I'm sort of with Ozzy on that one.
Yeah, really well articulated. I was talking with Joe Wisby from the Beatles Books podcast some time ago, and I remember him saying, asked a similar kind of question, and he talked about his reasons and finished by saying, you know, we were lucky to have them, you know, and the world has been better for it, hasn't it?
It definitely has. And I mean, I think, like, of all the times in history I could have lived, you know, I mean, it would have been cool to be maybe in Mozart's time and, you know, hear that. But to have grown up when the Beatles were new and still working and still putting stuff out, I mean, I feel incredibly blessed for that. You know, it's just I really lucked out on the being born lottery there.
Well, you've become a leading contributor to the world of Beatle authorship along the way, and continue to make great contributions to that. So thank you so much for that work. And I know you're very active in the world of the Beatles, particularly with the pod. Where could people find you if they were looking to dig deeper?
Okay. Well, the New York Times archive is online. You can find any of my Time stuff looking that way. I still write for Beatle Fan, which is, one of the last surviving fanzines, and really, for me, the best of them all through the years. And I write these days a lot for the Wall Street Journal. In fact, in today's paper, I reviewed the Power to the People John Lennon box set. And for the Journal, it's like with the Times, it's a combination of classical things and Beatles things. They let me do that too.
Yeah.
So, I have a podcast with Ken Michaels and Darren DeVivo called Things We Said Today. And that's every 2 weeks. You can find that on YouTube or Apple Podcasts if you want just the audio version. And let's see what else. That's about it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I know you mentioned it's still in the background being put together as a deal and an arrangement. Do you have a sense of when McCartney Legacy Volume 3 may hit us?
Right. So we're thinking we can deliver it 2 years from when we sign the contract. So let's say we would deliver it at the end of 27.
Yeah.
And then it would take another 9 months to a year for them to do the editorial process and all that. So I would guess 2028. The next one would be the 90s. And then the next one would be, the whole rest of his life, from 2000 on. I mean, a lot of what he's doing, in since 2000 has been touring.
Yes.
So, and it's very hard to write about a tour.
Yeah.
I think we did okay in the first 2 volumes, partly because Adrian found, for instance, people from Showco, which did the technical side of the tours. And so they had tons of really interesting stories about what went on, to get the shows out there. And so a lot of stuff like that. And the last volume will be difficult because there's so much touring. And you don't want it. And he plays basically the same set every time. There are basically two theories of live performance. There's like his, which is it's a show and it's like a Broadway show, and it's, the lighting, everything is choreographed. The stories he tells in between are usually about the same. And then on the other hand, you've got like Hendrix. Hendrix would do 2 shows in a night and they'd be totally different shows.
Yeah.
So, there are 2 ways of looking at it, and this is his. And so that's a challenge for us to write about. And anyway, but it's going to be fun. We're going to love it.
Yeah, I'm sure you're both up for it. Thank you again for being so generous with your time. It's been terrific to sit with you and capture some of your own journey along the way.
It's been fun. Thanks for having me.
We hope you enjoyed the show. You know the name, look up the socials. You'll find us on Facebook and Instagram, where we can all come together. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe and spread the word. It all helps raise the profile of the You Can Talk to Me podcast. Thanks for listening.